Our study of the scriptures continues today as we are marching through chronologically through the scriptures. We come today to the book of 2 Samuel chapter 18 and Psalm 26. Now, the focus of our devotional, because this is such a great crossroads in the scripture, we will consider only 2 Samuel chapter 18 for our daily devotional. Now, I've titled the devotional, Weeping and Wailing, the Death of a Rebel. 2 Samuel chapter 18. Now, let's consider the defeat and the slaying of Absalom in chapter 18. You'll notice in the first three verses, David's organization and the people's objection. Now, with his men and their families safely across the Jordan River, David, a skilled strategist, organized his soldiers and appointed captains over companies of hundreds and thousands. So when the people learned that David was fleeing from Jerusalem, literally thousands of his soldiers gathered with him. Now, we read in chapter 18 that the army he divided into three parts, and he assigned over them three of his most formidable leaders. Now, David sent forth a third part of the people under the hand of Joab. He has been the captain of the army. A third part under the hand of another man named Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, by the way, Joab's brother. And a third part under the hand of Ittai, that is the Gittite. Now, David then declared, I will surely go forth with you myself, in verse 2. In other words, David's saying, I will go with you to war. But we read that the people objected to the king's presence on the battlefield. You see, they understood the king would be the principal focus of the enemy's attack. Therefore, should he be killed, all of this warfare would be for naught. And then notice, if you would, verses 4 through 5, how David reviewed his soldiers and issued a foolish command. Now, David heeded the counsel of the people, and we read that he took his place at the gate of the city to review those going to war on his behalf in verse 4. And yet, once again, David evidenced a prevailing character weakness when he commanded his generals, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom. You find that in verse 5. Well, as a parent, I understand David's request that Absalom be the object of compassion. And yet, in my opinion, such a command was unwise. While he wanted to spare the life of his rebellious insurrectionist son, his request risked disheartening the men who were willing to risk their lives to put down Absalom's insurrection. Now, I believe David's request arose from the guilt of his own sins. And this, by the way, is not the first time we've observed that weakness in David. Now, his adultery with Bathsheba, his failure to address Amnon's sin, who had raped Absalom's sister Tamar, well, the king's failures had frustrated and inflamed Absalom's rebellion. And yet David desired his warriors might, quote, deal gently with Absalom for my sake, we read in verse 5. Well, now we come to verses 6 through 8, and I would suggest the heading of this might be the fateful battle in the woods of Ephraim. Now, the two armies of Israel, one loyal to David and the other that supported Absalom's insurrection, faced one another in what is described as the forest of Ephraim, chapter 18 and verse 6. Now, the battle was short-lived as the king experienced forces overwhelm the poorly led followers of Absalom. Before that day ended, we read that 20,000 men of Israel were slain. Now, though Absalom's soldiers greatly outnumbered David's army, his strategy to attack from three fronts scattered the battle, quote, over the face of all the country. And the wood, that is the forest, devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Verse 8. Well, the rugged terrain of the forest with its ravines swallowed up Absalom's army. And then you notice this fateful moment, the humiliation and the slaying of Absalom, beginning in verse 9 through verse 15. Now, David's proud, undisciplined son had come to a tragic, ignoble end. Fleeing the king's men, Absalom became entangled in the thick boughs, or boughs, I guess you could say, of a great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was literally taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away, in verse 9. Now, there have been many that have suggested that Absalom was hung by his thick locks of hair. However, the scriptures record it was his head that was caught hold of the oak. Rather than his hair, it might have been Absalom's neck that caught hold in the fork of a limb. And some suggest that the impact may have even broken his neck and paralyzed him, but yet failed to kill him. Now, David's army was aware. He had commanded that Absalom was to be dealt with, quote, gently. When a soldier of David's troop found the king's son suspended by a limb, he reported his finding to Joab in verse 10. And Joab reproved the man for his failure to slay Absalom in verse 11. However, that soldier proved to be a man of principle, and he obeyed the king's command and had spared Absalom. He assured Joab that no amount of silver would give him cause to slay the king's son in verse 12. And that same soldier then went further in his observation, and he revealed he knew Joab's character. And had he killed Absalom, he would have taken sides against him. That is, he would have killed the soldier for disobeying the king. Well, Joab then departed and decided to take matters in his own hand, and he found Absalom just as he had been told. In verse 14, he disobeyed the king's orders. He thrust 3 darts through Absalom's heart. And afterward, 10 of Joab's armor-bearers finished the job by brutalizing and ultimately slaying the king's son in verse 15. Well, now we come to the end of the rebellion, verses 16 through 18. Now, Absalom's death marked the end of the insurrection, and Joab, then we read, blew the trumpet, signaling for David's soldiers to withdraw and allow those who had followed Absalom to return to their tents, in verse 16 and 17. Now, Absalom's body was removed from the tree, cast into a pit, over which we read that great stones were piled. In his youthful zeal, we know earlier in our study that Absalom had raised up a pillar to memorialize his name in Israel. However, it's the pit and the heap of stones piled on his dead body that was a tragic memorial to his inglorious end. Then notice with me verses 19 through 33, and here David receives news of Absalom's death. Now, David and a watchman had waited for an update from the battlefront. One young man, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, known for being a fast runner, volunteered to take the news of the battle's outcome to the king. Well, Joab, however, chose Cushai. Now, he's a non-Hebrew man, to be his messenger, perhaps because Cushai, would deliver the news of Absalom's death without patriotic zeal displayed by Ahimaaz. Well, undeterred, Ahimaaz pressed Joab to allow him to take the news to the king, and he soon, in his flight, passed by Cushai. Well, Ahimaaz was the first to arrive before David with the news that the king's soldiers had won the day. Now, as feared in verse 20, David's heart and thoughts turned to Absalom in verse 32, and he inquired what had become of his son. Well, the news of Absalom's death was spoken discreetly as Cushai conveyed, and I'm going to read verse 32. All that rise against thee to do thee harm, that is, O king, be as that young man is. In other words, he is dead. David was overwhelmed by the news of his son's death, and we read that he retreated to the privacy of a chamber, a room that was over the city gate of that place. There the king wept, saying, "O my son Absalom, my son, my son Absalom. Would God I had died for thee. O Absalom, my son, my son. I can imagine, and I can almost hear the wails and the cries of grief that poured forth from David. He was inconsolable. Though David's army had earned a great victory, his grief and sorrow caused, and I quote, the victory that day to be turned into mourning unto all the people. You see, the king not only felt the despair of his son's death, but he understood, no doubt, that the consequence of his sin was now borne by his family. Indeed, if he could, David would have given his life for his son, Absalom. Now, there's an important spiritual lesson here. It would be one that is good not only for leaders, but for church members to heed. It is this: leaders sacrifice moral authority when they fail to address sin in their life and family. Let me say that again. Leaders sacrifice moral authority when they fail to address sin in their life and family. That truth is seen throughout the scriptures. For instance, Eli's failure to confront the sins of his sons marked the end of the judgeships in Israel, for the people demanded a king. Well, sadly, there are many contemporary instances of that same principle, from politics to ministries. I have observed that leaders who are weak on crime and familiar, that is, family sins, they are often plagued by moral failures in their lives and families. In other words, when you see a man who is weak on dealing with sin, it is often a transparent moment into that man's heart, and perhaps covering his own or his family's sins. Now, moral and family failures, you see, are indicative of weakness. Now, sadly, our society is beset by emboldened Absaloms who have no fear of law or consequences. I see the same weaknesses continue to plague ministries, failing churches, dying and closed Christian colleges, Christian universities that are wilting away. It seems to be all plagued with administrators and faculty who, like David, are compromised by moral failures in their personal lives and families. Well, the result has been a lack of corporate discipline in the classrooms and the lives of teachers and administrators. You see, when leaders abdicate their moral authority, they cater to undisciplined, immature Absaloms who erode and eventually destroy churches, schools, and institutions. Well, there's the challenge for us. Let us not only choose not to be an Absalom, but let us choose not to make David's failure and cater to the sins of youth. For invariably, it will erode your family, it'll destroy your church, and if you're the head or a leader of a Christian school or an institution, it will eventually destroy that leadership moment in your life. Well, God bless you. May you and I be very much aware of the cancer of rebellion, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of those close to us. Thank you for being a part of our daily devotion. God bless.